So, how did Annabeth go from being a neglected, homeless demigod to being one of the most ridiculously well respected heroes in the modern age? We get glimpses at her childhood in multiple different points of not just the Percy Jackson and Heroes of Olympus series, but we also get some clues sprinkled around the Magnus Chase books as well. So, let's dive into everything that we know about Annabeth's childhood and talk about how she got to where she is today. A few videos ago, we started a little game which worked out pretty well and helped introduce some like minded fans. So, we're going to take a stab at doing that again. It's easy. Just go down to the comments and leave a quote from one of your favorite Percy Jackson books. Then go to someone else's comment and guess what book it's from and who said it. You guys seemed to enjoy it last time, so let's go again. But while you're doing that, let's talk about Annabeth's childhood. First, we have to rewind back to Harvard, where Frederick Chase was working on his doctorate in military history. And this is where he first crossed paths with the goddess Athena, who was infatuated with his creativity. It's important to understand that Athena doesn't have children with mortal men in the traditional sense, since she's one of the maiden goddesses. But instead what she does is she molds the combined thoughts and creative nature of herself and the mortal that she admires. Annabeth was born as the brainchild of the two, and was gifted to Frederick. Even though he was not in place to have a daughter, Athena sent baby Annabeth to Frederick's doorstep in a golden cradle carried by the west wind, Zephyros. But he was far too focused on his career and studies as a historian. But Athena was forbidden from keeping the child for herself, so Annabeth was left in Frederick's care despite his objections. He tried to get Athena to take Annabeth somewhere else, anywhere else, but Athena made it clear that the young girl was his responsibility now. Heroes are meant to be raised among mortals, and unfortunately, much like Annabeth herself, Frederick was not very emotionally intelligent as Annabeth grew up. He graduated, and we know they lived in Virginia, where Annabeth was a child, though his family originally goes all the way back to Boston. But more on that in just a minute. When he was finally ready for a family, Annabeth was already 5, and Frederick remarried, where he had 2 children with his new wife. Is it technically remarried? If he's never been married before, he just got married. He didn't marry Athena. What we find out later, however, is that her extended family is just as strange as her parental situation. And one summer when she was 7, she went to Boston to visit her Uncle Randolph's manor for Thanksgiving. Unbeknownst to her, her cousin Magnus had a similarly complicated childhood, as he was the son of the Norse god Frey and Annabeth's aunt Natalie. While the two played upstairs, the family argued on the ground level, and Annabeth unknowingly played with some of Uncle Rudolph's Norse runestones, and it's here that she first reveals her plan to run away to her cousin Magnus. Despite being just 7 years old, she understood that her father did not want her, and he didn't have the emotional intelligence to raise her properly. He was too preoccupied with her step-siblings, and so her stepmother had to be directly involved in disciplining her, despite the fact that Annabeth was always dealing with the mythological side of her life, and her stepmother did not understand. We know that shortly before she left, Arachne would send swarms of spiders into Annabeth's room where they would terrify her relentlessly, but they always hid right before her stepmother got there. Frederick was too preoccupied with his work to deal with his screaming daughter, and so Annabeth's infuriated stepmother kept scolding her night after night, because she was under the belief that Annabeth was making all of this up for attention. Every night for 3 days straight, however, the spiders returned to swarm her again. But the bites would always fade, and the spiders would always hide before she could show anyone the evidence. This only made her stepmother more irritable with her. And it's important to mention that her stepmother didn't massively mistreat her just one time. It was a prolonged, long-term situation that's difficult to articulate. It's easy to write in one large fight that ended their relationship, but Annabeth's past has a lot more nuance and complexity to it. We can't point to very many specific examples of Annabeth's stepmother neglecting and mistreating her, but we know that it happened in small doses every day. Over time, it stacked up, and Frederick was nowhere to be seen, though the incident with the spiders was just one of several occasions where Annabeth was emotionally abandoned. We don't know exactly what time of year Annabeth ran away, but we do have a few clues. First, we know that in the diary of Luke Castellan, sunset is said to be at about 7, which would take place in the fall. But we also know that Annabeth spent several months fighting on her own with the help of Athena and just a mortal hammer. This means that we don't think that she left right after that Thanksgiving with Magnus, but she probably waited until winter passed so her chances of survival would be better. Even at 7, we think that Annabeth was smart enough to know that surviving in the spring would be much easier than the winter, so she probably ran away when the weather warmed up. From here, she spent all summer fighting on her own, until eventually she found herself in the Richmond Iron Works district at some point in the fall, the same neighborhood as the manor of Halcyon Green. This is where she was hiding under a sheet of scrap metal when she was approached by a fellow demigod, and when he removed her cover, she almost brained him with her hammer. Instead of hurting him, however, this is where she first met Talia and Luke. And if you want a full breakdown of how they met and what they were up to leading up to meeting Annabeth, we have a full video on that too. At this point, Luke decided that the best thing to do was to trust the girl who almost cracked his skull open, with a dagger that he had recovered from the mansion. We know that for months they created makeshift hideouts and safe houses, many of which still contained a cache of resources that they had collected. In the Sea of Monsters, Annabeth leads Percy to one of her hideaways after escaping the Princess Andromeda. So even though we don't know exactly how many are still up, we do know that they built several. From here, we know of several things that happened to Annabeth, but we don't have an ironclad order of events, such as when they first came across the Hunters of Artemis and met Zoe Nightshade. We know that Zoe wanted to recruit Talia to their cause, but she refused so she didn't have to abandon Luke and Annabeth. but we don't know if this happened before or after they met Hermes for the first time. If any of you have any evidence to suggest that this definitely happened before or after, please let us know. We just couldn't find anything concrete. At some point, however, we know that the girls were injured in Connecticut and needed immediate first aid. So reluctantly, Luke led the two of them back home to May Castellan's house. He had told them stories of his mother, but would only ever bring them there if the situation was dire. And we see that his love for them outweighed his fear and resentment toward his mother. May helped the two of them get patched up. And this is when Hermes arrived to finally meet Luke for the first time. We, as the audience, know the exact conversation that took place and why Luke felt the way that he did, but Annabeth only heard snippets between Luke and Hermes. Even at such a young age, she was very defensive of Luke, though after the conversation was over and Luke left, she and Talia joined him. But at this point, Hermes had already requested for a satyr to be sent to their location. It's important to remember that while they were on the run, they weren't just surviving one random monster encounter after another. They were actively being hunted. Hades was working tirelessly to track down Talia in particular. And again, we have a full video talking about the tragedy of Talia's final stand and why her soul would never find peace in the hands of Hades. So go check it out if you're interested in that one. The reason why they decided that they needed to go to camp wasn't because they wanted to, but because Luke realized that the forces of the underworld would soon overwhelm them, and he needed to get the girls someplace that they would be safe. So they crossed paths with Grover, but the road to camp was not a sure journey, and it took a lot just to get them from Connecticut to Long Island. On the way, Grover got disoriented and led them into the lair of a rogue Cyclops, which was able to use its voice mimicry to lure the rest of them into being captured. We actually have a personal theory that the Cyclops used the voice of Jason to get Talia, but this hasn't ever been formally confirmed, and it's just a headcanon right now. But we thought it was fun to mention either way. We do know that the Cyclops used Annabeth's father's voice to try to get her to come out of hiding, but she was able to resist the temptation. Whether she survived because she was smart enough to see through the trick, or because she was indifferent to helping her father is not completely clear, but either option adds a lot of depth to her character, especially at such a young age. Annabeth was the only one who was able to evade capture, and the Cyclops had strung Talia, Luke, and Grover up above boiling pots. Left alone, Annabeth had only her wits and her dagger to get her friends down, and she did so by sneaking up on a Cyclops and stabbing it in the foot. She was able to slip away in the ensuing rampage and cut Talia down, who took it from there and freed the rest of them. But by then, it was already too late. Agents of the Underworld had made up precious time and were now gaining on them. So this final sprint to Camp Half-Blood took place with Hellhounds and Furies at their heels. In The Lightning Thief, we know that Grover was carried unconscious over Half-Blood Hill, which is why this rescue is regarded as a failure, since he didn't actually escort them to camp in the home stretch. And he blames himself immensely for years after this. This is the point where we get into the events of Talia's final stand, since she knew that the Hellhounds were after her. But one thing that we didn't mention in our last Talia video was the key scene from the Titan's Curse. In San Francisco, Percy and Talia are cornered by the Manticore, and Talia wholeheartedly believes that she is going to make her final stand again, and she starts crying. She hides it well, but Percy's right next to her and notices. She white-knuckle grips her spear, and we can see close up just how terrified she is to be doing this again, and so we can only imagine what she must have been feeling at the moment. The legend of Talia's final stand paints her as a noble hero, which of course she was, but it makes no mention of just how scared she was. That day scarred her for life, and Annabeth couldn't do anything but watch as Luke dragged her and Grover over the hill, kicking and screaming as she watched Talia die. When she arrived at camp, she began talking to her father again through letters, but every time he tried to talk her into coming home, she refused, and subsequently became one of the youngest year-round campers under Chiron's care. At some point, her father sent his college ring to camp with the hope that one day Annabeth would forgive him and give home life another shot. We do know that she tried going home once before, but only made it a couple weeks before calling Chiron and telling him to come get her since monsters were still attacking her and her home life hadn't changed. Chiron, knowing the hardships of demigod life better than anyone, obliged and went to bring her back. Now under the care of a horse and an alcoholic, she dove headfirst into her studies so she could identify any monster or figure she needed at a moment's notice. She took a wilderness survival course from Grover, and we know that at some point she almost killed Connor Stoll for putting a tarantula in her bunk, but she was able to restrain herself. At 10, however, she read the Great Prophecy for the first time, and Chiron knew that she would have a critical role to play when the prophecy came true. After reading it, she had nightmares for weeks, and she believed that every new camper was going to be the one she was waiting for, which makes sense when we remember that the last child of the Big Three died defending her. She developed a reputation among the Athena children and the camp as a whole for being incredibly intelligent, even for Athena standards. She started younger than most and stayed the longest of just about anyone, so she became respected as a capture-the-flag tactician and wartime strategist by the time she was 12. But it was very rare for her to ever leave the barriers of camp for any reason. We know that for her 12th birthday, Athena gifted her a New York Yankees cap that would turn her invisible, which would have been July, the summer before Percy first arrived, since we know that her birthday is July 12th. We also know that she went on the winter solstice field trip to Olympus during the December before Percy arrived, but her adventures outside of camp were sparse. When Percy arrived, however, her world opened rapidly. and her already respected reputation skyrocketed as she aided one quest after another. From here, we get into the events of the Lightning Thief and the rest of her modern adventures. But that's where we'll end. So we want to know what you guys think. We love this series, we love talking about the series, and we would love it if you join in the conversation. As always, stay safe, demigods, take care, and we'll see you in the next one.